May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Quite often, I find myself in a conversation with people about problems in their lives. Sometimes these problems are quite serious. Other times, what is happening is more on the side of frustrating or annoying. Sometimes the conversation includes not only one person talking to me, but also others talking together. And sometimes, together, the conversation turns to what people believe or don't believe to be true about God's presence in the situation. Invariably, when these conversations take place, someone eventually says something like, well, you just have to have faith. And that usually stops the conversation. I always walk away from those conversations, wondering when and how faith became a conversation stopper. When and how the very mention of the word faith became the last word on the subject. It certainly has not always been that way. For most of human history, faith has been more of a first word. This is certainly true when we look at how faith operated in the lives of the first followers of Jesus. For the next several weeks, we'll do just that. We will be reading from the book of Acts. It's the second volume written by Luke, first volume being the Gospel of Luke. And then he picks up after the resurrection and begins to talk about the beginnings of the early church in the book of Acts. We start this morning with some words taken from a sermon by Peter, a sermon that takes place shortly after the experience of Pentecost in the book of Acts. We save that, even though it comes first for the day of Pentecost. But if you remember, that day of Pentecost was the day that the disciples became fully empowered by the Holy Spirit. Jesus had told them that the same Spirit of God, which had been present in him, would come to them and be present in them, and would become present in many others as well. You see, this was the power of the resurrection that the early followers of Jesus preached. It was a power not just for one Sunday morning, but for a lifetime up to and through our own. It was and is a power not only for a certain privileged few, but for any who were and are willing to receive that power of the risen Christ. This is the power of God, working God's goodness and love and transformation now through the body of the flesh and blood of faithful people like you and me, as once it had worked through the flesh and blood of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. That's the story that the book of Acts tells. It's the story of a people catching the Spirit and being moved out into the world in love and compassion to do the same kind of transforming work that Jesus once did among them and that God did in Jesus' life and death and resurrection. You see, for the first followers of Jesus, to have faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus was more about a series of experiences that they had than it was about any particular doctrine or teaching. It was about the experience of the living Christ continuing to live with power and reality through them. To have faith in this continuing experience was definitely much more of a first word than a last word. Much more of the beginning of a conversation than the end of one. Much more of the beginning of struggling and looking and searching to find out what that would mean for their lives and for the lives of others. More of a first word than a last word. So how can faith become a first word in our lives again? Mostly, we need to remember that faith is not an end in itself. That is to say, the object is not to have faith as if it were some commodity that we could go out and get some of. As if it were something that you either have enough of, like enough water or enough Kleenex. The first step is to realize it's not something we go out and get, not something we have. Instead, the object is to allow faith in God's goodness and transforming power no matter what. To allow faith in that goodness and transforming power that we see in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. To allow faith in this goodness and transforming power to become a lens through which we see the whole world, through which we see every aspect of our lives in that world. As we continue over the next several weeks to read from this book of Acts, this is exactly what we'll see. We will see people, as they catch this faith, becoming transformed by this power and goodness. We will see them beginning to live their lives differently, seeing their lives differently, seeing the things that go wrong and the things that go right differently, seeing who's in and who's out differently. We will see this change take place in them as individuals and as a community. And so we need to remember that it's not about having faith, but letting faith have us. In addition, we need to remember that such faith in God's goodness and transforming power usually begins not so much as a first-hand experience, but usually begins first by trusting the experience of others. Even for the disciples, this was so, as John tells it. Even though Thomas knew he had to see for himself if he were ever going to truly believe, he still had enough faith in the experience of the other disciples to have been in that room again. If he had not had that kind of faith in their experience, even though he knew it wasn't enough for him, but if he hadn't had some faith in their experience, some faith in them, he wouldn't have been there. He would have gone back to his own life, and he might not have had the experience. And the other disciples, in the chapter of John's Gospel right before this, they had enough faith in what Mary Magdalene came and said to them about finding an empty tomb to go see for themselves. They didn't just wave her off and go about their business. They hadn't seen for themselves, but they had enough faith that something had happened in her life that they went to see what it was all about. And if they had not gone, they might have never seen. Even Mary Magdalene, who went there and thought that the body had been stolen, had enough faith that somebody who appeared to just be a simple gardener might know what had happened, that she spoke to him. She didn't just run off, but had enough faith in something that perhaps this man might tell her what was going on, that she spoke to him and was surprised by her own experience of the risen Lord. She was the first one in the Gospel of John to have had such an experience. You see, our own faith experiences usually come to us because we're willing to have faith in the experience of others, even when we haven't seen ourselves. We get where we need to be, to have our own experiences, sometimes by looking through the lens of someone else's experience, through the lens of someone else's faith. There is, in fact, in religious education circles, an entire theory about how faith develops and matures. It's been around a long, long time. The theory is based primarily on three elements. First, that we usually catch the faith of others. We catch the faith of others first, sometimes before we catch it ourselves. We catch the faith of others who have already experienced the goodness and transforming power of God in their lives. Second, faith grows in us as we learn more, practice more, discover more, and experience more by belonging to a community of faith. There's something about God that always draws us into community. That at the very basis of who we were designed to be, we were designed to be not all on our own, but in relationship to others, to God, to ourselves, and to all creation. And so it is that even when we haven't had a direct experience of God's presence in our life that we can have faith in, somehow being together in worship and education and fellowship, pastoral care, outreach, and in the kind of evangelism, not the street corner kind, but the kind of evangelism that is making known by word and example the goodness and love of God in every way that we can, anytime we can. It is through all of these things of living in community together that that seed of faith begins to grow. The third way, according to this theory, is that we question and we probe, and sometimes we even express our own doubts. We follow the lead of Thomas. When we don't see it or feel it, we ask for what we need. We search and we test the faith that we have borrowed from other people and the faith that we've experienced in community together. We search it and test it and question it so that we can begin to discover what it looks like and what it means in our own lives. This third step, this probing, questioning, testing, and sometimes doubting step, is a step that it is important not to skip. Because the third step is incredibly important in the development of the kind of faith that moves from being an end in itself to being the beginning of figuring out how we can experience and express God's love and goodness and transforming power in the world. But what we always need to remember, especially when we are tempted to think or say that all someone needs is to have enough faith, what we need to remember is this: the seeking and searching and testing that lead to deeper and deeper experiences of the risen Christ. These experiences are more likely to occur when the very idea of faith and the very ideas that faith raises form the beginning of a conversation and not the end.